Some interpreters of Esther have accused the book of being secular and deistic. After all, the book of Esther does not once mention God by name. It makes no references to the law of Moses, and it does not overtly include any traditionally pious religious behaviors, such as prayer or the keeping of Jewish dietary laws or any of that. Perhaps this should not be surprising to us. After all, as we observed in our last discussion, in the days of Esther, the Jewish people were living in exile in the Persian Empire by God's will to judge them for their ancestors' generational refusal to live in submission to the covenant of Sinai. Esther describes a season of Jewish history when deism, the belief that God is not personally involved in our affairs, was a way of life. This was a consequence of the curse of exile, and the book of Esther has described one incident that summarizes the plight endured by those who are judged by God. The title of today's discussion is, There's Something About Providence. Providence describes God's governance, God's watch care, the ways in which God is involved and active in the world and in our lives. There's something in Esther chapter 4 about providence. If you have access to a Bible today, I invite you to turn with me to Esther chapter 4, and just by way of review, to this point in Esther's story, Esther has been elevated to the position of queen by the Persian king Xerxes, whom the scriptures call Ahasuerus, as a replacement for his official queen Vashti. In Esther chapter 3, a powerful ruler in Xerxes' kingdom named Haman convinced Xerxes to allow his citizens to slaughter people of Jewish ethnicity and to keep any wealth of those they killed for themselves on one particular day. Chapter 4, among other things, chronicles the response of Mordecai and the Jewish people to this edict of the king. Esther chapter 4, and I'm going to begin reading in verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went through the city wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province, wherever the king's command and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why. Hatak went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king to make supplication to him and to entreat him for her people. Hatak went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Where is God in Esther? Did you notice any mention of God's name in Esther chapter 4? Were there any clear allusions to God or God's activity? There were not. Why has overt reference to God been written out of or written around or simply excluded from Esther's story? Where is God in this moment of crisis for the Jewish people of Persia? Why didn't Mordecai or the other Jews cry out to him? Why didn't God intervene in some miraculous or inexplicable way? Where is God when the world is falling apart? There's something here about providence, about God's watch care, God's governance of the universe. But in order to grasp what I think Esther might suggest to us today, we have to start with a larger context. We recall that the book of Esther is one of a series of texts that was born out of a particular people and a particular culture, the people and culture of ancient Israel. In fact, all of the books in the Christian Bible have grown out of this people and culture, who we call the prophets and apostles of Israel. We allow these texts a preeminent voice in our thinking about God and our living with respect to Him because God chose Israel out of all the nations of the earth to be His people and to be His unique spokespersons to all nations on earth. When we speak today of the culture of ancient Israel, the way they lived, thought, spoke, and so on, we use the phrase Hebraic culture. And Hebraic culture embraced something a bit foreign to many of us who herald from Western cultures. It's called block logic. In his book, Our Father Abraham, Jewish Roots of the Christian Faith, Marvin Wilson has explained block logic in the following way. He writes, the Hebrews often made use of block logic. That is, concepts were expressed in self-contained units or blocks of thought. These blocks did not necessarily fit together in any obviously rational or harmonious pattern. This way of thinking created a propensity for paradox, antinomy, or apparent contradiction, as one block stood in tension, an often illogical relation to the other. Hence, polarity of thought or dialectic often characterized block logic. Now, block logic does not appear to have been a shortcut around critical thinking. Block logic comes in when God reveals something to be true that from a human perspective seems to not be quite so true, or perhaps even to be false. Rather than deciding between the two options, God's revelation or human experience, for instance, the Hebrew prophets would often hold the two views in tension and try to live as if both were true simultaneously. So rather than resolving the tension logically or intellectually or rationally, as Western cultures might, the prophetic tradition of Israel preferred to attempt to find a way to live in the midst of the tension. Consequently, we should observe that there appears to be tension like this in Esther chapter 4 with respect to God's providence, with respect to God's watch care over the Jewish people in Persia. When Mordecai and the Jewish people first heard the news of Xerxes' edict, they did not pray or appeal to God. At least, the text does not say overtly that they did that. Instead, they mourned. They cried out publicly on the streets of the cities of Persia. That sounds a bit deistic, doesn't it? A bit like God is up in heaven doing His thing while the Jewish people of Persia are preparing for destruction. A bit like people on earth are more likely to react than God who is in the heavens. In some ways, Mordecai was reacting like a deist. He was behaving as though God was unwilling to help or indifferent to their plight. And so Mordecai and the Jewish people mourned before the citizens of Persia, and Mordecai pled with Esther, not with God, to help the Jews. But as I said, there's tension. Look again at Esther chapter 4, beginning in verse 12. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place." How did Mordecai know that to be true? Is this language simply rhetorical, or is it theological? And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Wait, what? The drunkenness and impulsiveness of Xerxes, the decision of Vashti, the months-long sex contest, and all the other sordid stuff that led to Esther's enthronement might be for something, for some purpose? The who knows language reminds us of deism, but the rest sounds like some underlying belief that the Jewish people are not on a runaway train. Marvin Wilson would call the tension in Mordecai's confession block logic. Mordecai seems to have been living and choosing as though his fate and the fate of the Jewish people were entirely in the hands of people, of Xerxes, of the Persians, of Haman, of Esther. yet he was confessing like someone was in control, that somehow deliverance would arrive, that somehow even Esther herself might actually be chosen as a vessel of deliverance. Mordecai's so mixed up from our perspective, isn't he? He reacted to the news like God was indifferent or unconcerned with the situation. He didn't pray. He confessed belief that God would in fact bring deliverance, and then he guessed that maybe Esther might be the vessel of deliverance, but then again, maybe not. And then he pressed Esther to put her life at risk on the off chance that she might be chosen to save the Jewish people, but then again, deliverance might come from someplace else, and Esther might die. Does Mordecai seem irredeemably confused? I don't believe he was confused. Mordecai was an Israelite, and therefore one of a people chosen by God to have unique insight into the relationship between God and humans. He believed God cared for the Jewish people, and that God could and would intervene in history to preserve them as he had promised their ancestors. But he also knew that God does not always act and intervene in ways humans might prefer. And so he reacted as though God might, in fact, allow the worst to happen, which God so often did in the history of Israel. Mordecai confessed his belief that God would intervene, but he also acted to influence the way in which God's intervention took shape. Mordecai seems both deist and theist, both one who takes his fate into his own hands and one who believes that God can and will act in history. Living as a faithful follower of the God of Israel who became flesh in the person of Jesus is not simply a matter of determining God's will and walking in it. In many times and seasons, we'll have no confidence in the will of God if we're honest with ourselves. Like Mordecai and Esther, we who follow this God, the only God, may often have to utter those horrible words, "Who knows?" The lazy and the passive have so often been written out of the story of God's people. Mordecai and Esther took the initiative to secure their place in God's future. They did not do it in rebellion against God by overtly rejecting what he had revealed to them, but neither did they take the initiative at the express command of God. They chose to act despite their confusion. They risked their lives on the shaky ground of who knows. This may be messy, but it's also instructive. Perhaps we too, within the confines of God's teachings and instructions for us, should take the initiative to move history in a direction more consistent with God's kingdom and God's express promises than it presently seems to be pointed. Perhaps like Mordecai and Esther, we must believe in God's providence and sovereignty and submit to those beliefs in the ways we choose to live and interact with others. But perhaps we must also sometimes live like deists, like the shape of the future will depend to a degree on our initiative, on our involvement, on our machinations, and on our sacrifices. We serve a God who has acted and will act in the course of human history. We serve a God who holds together the fabric of the universe. But we also serve a God who has, in the words of C.S. Lewis, not chosen to write the whole of history with his own hand. This is block logic, the supreme governance of God and the real and potent responsibility of humans. And we must choose to live in the midst of this tension, living as though both were true at the same time, in the same circumstance. This is life. This is block logic. We submit to God, but we must take responsibility for our lives as well. Maybe some here are stuck on pause today. Maybe you've been waiting for God to hand deliver a solution or an option or a turnkey opportunity into your lap. Perhaps you've been praying for clear direction and all you can see are options. As long as your choice is not in rebellion against the clearer teachings of God in the Christian Bible, might I encourage you today to stop stalling, to take the initiative to push the future in the direction you wish it would go, a direction that would be preferable to you, to your family, and maybe even to the world. Who knows? Maybe you'll fail. Maybe you'll only find slightly better options. Or maybe even like Esther, you'll affect the lives of many more than just yourself. We must, of course, pray and appeal to God. But it is also possible that God's refusal to answer is not so much a no as it might be an invitation for you to act yourself. May those who have ears to hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.